Hello everyone at home, it's Wallace with Warphammer. I just got back from the Seattle Major, where I brought the Disciples of LAKOR Army of Renown, and I was able to use some really cool tactics at the tournament that allowed me to get some pretty interesting advantages in games. The tactics I'm going to show you have a lot of applicability to any faction that is bringing in allied demons, and hopefully you can take something away from the video.
So I want to start first with something that's super important to Disciples, which is summoning. I think Disciples is the go-to and probably the only faction that absolutely needs to master the use of this mechanical ability. So summoning is described in length in the Chaos Demons Codex, and I won't bore anyone that already knows the basics of it in detail. Essentially, if a unit stands still, that unit is allowed to summon at the end of the movement phase. The thing they summon has to be within 12 and 9 away from enemies, and when you summon, whatever it is that you summon costs you reinforcement points. So what I'm focused on right here, and I'll show you as an example with this model, this Master of Possession, is a way that you can help protect your characters from extra mortal wounds. So whenever you summon, you can roll up to 3 dice, and if you roll any duplicates on the dice, your character will take mortal wounds. So we want to avoid our character taking unnecessary mortal wounds, but you also want to make sure that you get enough power levels out of the dice that you roll to summon the things that you need. So let's say I want to summon something that is power level 4. I'll start by rolling 1 dice at a time. Well, I rolled a 4. I can now choose to stop rolling dice. So this is the interesting thing. You don't actually have to declare, since it's roll up to 3, that you're going to roll all 3 dice. You can just roll 1 at a time. Like if I rolled a 1 on this dice here, I could then roll another dice and then choose to stop. It doesn't say I have to declare or that I have to announce what it is I'm summoning. So you're allowed to roll 1 dice at a time, and this way, if you do get to a power level you want, like I just got to 4 here, I can choose to stop rolling those dice. So that showed us a way to protect our character from rolling any unnecessary duplicates and taking mortal wounds we didn't need to. This next tactic is really cool for the Master of Possession model specifically. So when I went to the Seattle Major, I brought a Master of Possessions in an Ox detachment, and I made sure he knew 2 very critical psychic powers. He knew Sacrifice, and he knew Incursion. So I'm going to talk about Incursion for a second. So Incursion is a Warp Charge 7 psychic power that if I successfully manifest it, it will allow him to summon, even if he moved that turn. So for instance, I could have him over here, and let's pretend that these Zangors you see right here are opponent Zangors. Well, let's say I want to summon on that objective, but it's outside of 12 inches of this character. So in my movement phase, I could advance him, get him right up here, so now he's in range to summon there. And then in the psychic phase, I can, attempt to summon there by casting Incursion. I would want to CP reroll that, which thankfully worked, but I got my cast on an 8. So this will allow me to cast Incursion and then summon a unit in my psychic phase despite him having moved. That's a pretty cool effect right off the bat, but that's not the full shenanigan you can pull off with this. So let me show you in this example. I just summoned with him using Incursion, and let's say I set up 10 Plague Bearers on the other side of this wall. And for sake of time, I'm just going to set up a few. You see where they are. Okay. So some of these Plague Bearers in range of 12 inches of him on the other side of that wall, grabbing that objective for me. But oh no, now he's exposed, and he's easy charge target for these Zangors the next turn that might want to come in here and kill my character. But let's assume I'm just slightly farther away from 9. I haven't actually measured it, I'm just eyeballing. So let's assume he's like right about there, away from 9 from them. I would then be able to use the stratagem Demonic Pact in order to summon again. So the Demonic Pact stratagem, a lot of people think it's locked to only if you summoned at the end of your movement phase, but it just says when you would summon a unit to the battlefield using the Demonic Ritual ability, which is what the Incursion just did. So I can now, in my psychic phase, spend a CP to essentially have him do it again. So now when I summon, I'm going to summon a second unit of Plague Bearers, and I'm going to summon it around my character, 9 inches away from the Zangors, bubble wrapping them so that they won't be a charge target. This is something I actually did quite a few times at the tournament, where I would have the model move up the table and then use his Demonic Pact stratagem in order to get a double summon out of him, which allowed me to do a lot of interesting things that I couldn't have otherwise. So the next thing I'm going to show you is something that revolves around the meat and potatoes of the Disciples of LAKOR faction. A lot of people are already familiar with this. These are the 2 critical spells off the Noctic discipline that the Army of Renowned gives you access to. So the first one is Wreathed in Shade, and the second one is Shrouded Step. So Wreathed in Shade is really basic. It just says when you choose the unit and the power goes off, I think it goes off on a 7, the unit you chose, it has to be infantry. Well, the enemy can't shoot them unless they're within 12 or it's the nearest visible. The second ability, Shrouded Step, this is probably the most important thing that you get out of taking the Disciples faction, or Army of Renown, excuse me. The Shrouded Step allows you to essentially de-jump a unit of infantry, picking them up and repositioning them outside of 9 inches of an enemy. So once you've mastered Shrouded Step, or like the way you use Shrouded Step, this will win you, I would say, the majority of the games that you do win. Just using this one technique well helps you have a really, really consistent game plan. And I'll show you what I mean right here. So first and foremost, I always bring the Epitome of Slaanesh because it gets +1 to cast, and it makes my psychic powers, those 2 ones I just mentioned, far more consistent. Some people really like bringing Change Casters instead because you can use 1 CP in order to automatically cast. You don't need to roll. But I just think that a lot of times that tithes you on CP that you're already running really tight on. So I tend to just go with the really low chance that I fail my Warp Charge 6 power. But what we're going to do is we're going to use Shrouded Step on this unit of Pink Horrors to steal an objective from this unit of Zangors that are on an objective. So you can, of course, always go for an 8-inch charge. So if I Shrouded Step these guys forward and put them outside of 9, because I have an instrument, that's going to give me an 8-inch charge into them. But I am feeling kind of cheeky. So I want to make this charge far more consistent. I want to make this charge almost a guarantee. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have my Master of Possessions over here on the table, and this is going to highlight that other spell I mentioned, Sacrifice. And I'm actually going to have him advance up the table. So we're going to advance him 4 inches plus his base move of 6. He's going to go all the way up here. Now I'm going to Shrouded Step. So she casts her Shrouded Step. It goes off on a 6, but she gets +1 to cast, so that'll go off on an 8. And then I get to jump these guys. I jump them right up next to Mr. Master of Possessions over here. I'll do that real quick. Boop, boop, boop. Boop. Okay, cool. And they're 9 inches back from the Zangors. Now, it's important I leave one of these Pink Horrors within 2 inches of this dude, because he's now going to cast Sacrifice, which, luckily for me, only has a Warp Charge value of 4, which, of course, goes off on a 6. Now, Sacrifice says that it's either do a mortal wound or remove a model within 2 as a casualty. I believe it's actually the latter. And once I've done that, I can heal a demon engine I have D3 wounds. Now, Disciples are not allowed to bring demon engines, so you're like, what are you doing with this? Well, this is what I'm doing. I'm going to kill this Pink Horror. Blah. And because I killed him, I'm now allowed to split him using the horror splitting ability. So I'm going to spend 14 reinforcement points to put these 2 blue horrors into play. And when I put them into play, I no longer have to follow that 9-inch restriction from Shrouded Step. I'm allowed to split them forward, but in coherency like this. So I'll gain 2 inches of movement off that, plus the base, So effectively 3 inches. So I'm taking 3 inches off that 8-inch charge and turning it into a 5-inch charge into the Zangors. So then when I go to charge those Zangos, well, I mean, I would have made it either way, but if I did not roll an 8, but I rolled something like a 6, I'm still going to be able to make it into combat because now this charge is only a 5-inch charge from the blue horror. So now I do my charge, I pump all my guys onto the objective, and voila, it is stolen from him. Beautiful. Thank you very much for the sacrifice, sir. This lone tactic is going to allow you to steal so many primary points from your opponent. This next tactic is really simple, but it's for if something goes horribly wrong and your opponent manages to wrap one of your models in combat. So when I say wrap, I mean like they have surrounded this pink horror and I'm physically unable to move it out of combat. So a lot of times when you're playing Disciples, you'll be committing units on a charge to steal an objective. And then on your following turn, you'll be trying to do things like fall back from combat, but stay outside of an inch of the models you fall back from, so that you can keep like contesting that objective. So like as an example, I might want to fall back to avoid a round of combat that is unnecessary if I'm in a situation like this. So like in a situation like this, I have my models on the objective. I know if I fall back and move my 6 inches, that I should be able to tap the objective with at least all 5 of them, and so that I can keep holding this. But if one of my models is trapped here, I'm not allowed to do that, and I'm not going to be able to effectively fall back. Like I'll be able to hold this objective still, but I'm going to take another round of combat in exchange for it. So that can be really painful, especially if the units that are holding me in combat are scarier than these Zangors. An example of that is I did this against some warriors in Seattle, some Tyranid warriors. So a way you get around that is, I believe the stratagem is called Legion of Shade. What it does is it's a stratagem you use either in your movement phase or your charge phase, and it allows one of your units to ignore model collision, so they can move horizontally through models as if they were not there. So a lot of times if I'm wrapped up like this and I want to get that pink horror out and I want to hold this objective and I want to stay outside of one and I want to avoid that round of combat, this strat is going to do it all for me. So I'm going to spend my CP and now I can move horizontally through models, and I'm just going to pick them up and put them right there. Beautiful. No more trap. So following that same logic with Legions of Shade, for the same reason that stratagem is really effective for getting you out of combat, it's also really effective for allowing you to create a wrap of your own on your opponent's models. So if I made a charge here and I used that stratagem in my charge phase, then when I complete my charge maneuver, I can actually finish through these models that I normally couldn't, and I can brick my 32 mils between the bases of these models, which will stop them now from falling back, which is extra cool if they have something like a vehicle behind them that I maybe want to pull into combat as well, because I want to stop it from having good movement next turn. So I could like tap that vehicle as well if I rolled well enough on my charge, stop that from doing what it wants to on its next turn, and also trap these units in combat, so even if this guy falls back, they're not going to be able to shoot me next turn, they'll only be able to charge me. So the next tactic I'm going to show you is for Bloodletters. So I always bring at least one unit of Bloodletters in the lists that I build. I'm currently running with a unit of 30 and then one unit of 20 at the moment. And the reason I'm doing that is because Bloodletters are one of the scarier models that you can bring to the tabletop while maintaining my Disciples obligations. So they're OBSEC, they're good at stealing objectives, they do a lot of damage, they're just a solid unit. They also have access to some insane strats. So first of all, they have Fight Twice, which everybody knows about and everybody should be scared of. Your opponent's going to have to punch you back in the face pretty hard if they do not want to die to your second round of combat when you use this unit. But that's actually not even the scariest stratagem they have. The scariest stratagem they have is a stratagem that I heard a lot of people refer to as kind of like a meme strat, like something nobody was using. But the strat actually is low-key incredibly good, especially in this current meta. And that stratagem is going to be the Rage Eternal stratagem. It essentially is a 3 CP strat that allows one of your Bloodletter units to fight on death. You have to roll for it, so only about 50% of your dudes are going to be doing it. But that unit can absolutely fight on death on the 4+. So you might ask yourself the question of, well, why do that? Wouldn't you rather just fight twice or warp surge this unit and fight twice or something? Well, I'll show you why. The reason is in the specific wording of the stratagem, it allows you to fight on death against the unit that that killed that model. So it does not actually check to see whether or not you would legally normally be able to attack that unit. In fact, it specifically says on the stratagem itself that it allows you to target units with those fight on death attacks that you otherwise normally wouldn't be able to attack against. So why does that matter so much? Well, I'll show you. This is an example. This is a real example from something that happened in Seattle, and it won me the game. So I was playing against a really good Eldar player, and he knew what Bloodletters do, so he screened them out super effectively. He had a unit of warp spiders that he left hanging around actually towards the front of his lines because of the warp spider's ability. Let's pretend these are warp spiders. I don't own Eldar. I'm a Chaos player. Warp spiders have this ability to jump after you declare them as the target of charge. So if I wanted to send my Bloodletters into them, they would just yeet themselves away, and I wouldn't be able to charge them anymore. But I didn't want that. I really needed to kill these warp spiders because they have really scary blast guns. So I know my priority target this game is doing as much damage as possible against that warp spiders unit, so that when my opponent goes to shoot me back, I don't just lose my army. So I need to charge the warp spiders, but they have a no charge rule. Well, what I'm going to do is actually interesting. So the warp spiders were near another unit of Eldar that did not have that ability. I think it was like a fire prism or something. It was some other unit that was nearby. Well, I declared my charge against that unit, not against them. And with the Bloodletters, you can use the Blood Banner to roll 3 dice on your charge, which means you're pretty much always getting it. So I rolled pretty well on my charge, and what I did is I put Bloodletters in combat here, but because when you charge, it's just a movement that you have to end within a half inch of that unit. It allowed me to also put a bunch of models around the unit of warp spiders that I actually wanted to get into combat with. Now, of course, I am not allowed to attack this unit. That's not a legal action. I did not declare them as a charge target. Even if I fight twice, it doesn't matter. I don't get to swing against them. That wouldn't be a legal target. However, in 9th edition for 40k, your opponent cannot choose to not make their attacks. They must make their attacks if they are able to. And so what I did was, once I got my guys into combat, I made dang well sure that every single one of these Bloodletters would be in range to be attacked by every single one of those warp spiders. And unfortunately for my opponent, his warp spiders all have a pretty decent number of attacks, especially with their Exarch. And then I spent my 3 CP strat so that I get to fight on death. The next layer to this interaction is going to be the fact that when you take a save in 40k, if you have multiple saves, like you have an invuln save and an armor save, you get to choose which one you make. You don't have to make the better of the two. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to probably kill the unit that was my primary charge target on my activation. Then when my opponent goes to activate with his warp spiders, because again, he can't choose not to, he puts all of his attacks into here, and he did like 10 wounds or something. I then said, okay, I'm going to choose my armor save, which is, it's either like a 6-up or a 7-up. It's significantly worse than just taking the 5-up demon save. And of course, I lost all 10 of my Bloodletters. So I lost 10 Bloodletters, and I rolled my fights on death. and I think something like 6 or 7 of them were able to fight back. Well, I now, because the stratagem says it does not have to normally be a legal target for that attack, am allowed to make that attack against the Warp Spider unit, even though I did not charge them, because they were the thing that killed these models. And because I fought Undeath, I managed to kill 3 of those Warp Spiders. Now all of a sudden I've significantly reduced the efficiency of my opponent's Warp Spider unit that otherwise would have blown me off the board, and I had no way to interact with turn 1 otherwise. One quick thing I wanted to just mention as an addendum to what I just showed you is I wasn't actually able to, on the charge, move the unit all the way into combat. I did leave them an inch away and then pile into them when I went to activate my unit, which pulled them into combat. I wasn't able to just charge into them. I had to stay outside of an inch and then pile into them, but it works effectively the same way. And the reason that's so good is not just because of Warp Spiders. That was just one example of a game it won me. It's because it allows you to, you can't declare a charge on something outside of 12 inches, even if I roll like a 15 on my charge roll. Well, let's say I move through units because of the Legion of Shade ability, and there's a unit that I want to get behind their screens that's like 13 inches away. Well, I could just, like, with Legion of Shade, move through this unit up here and outside of an inch, and then be equidistant between these models and choose to pile into this unit back here. So now all of a sudden I'm pulling their protected unit into combat from a ridiculously far distance away, and I'm still allowed to attack them because of the ability to fight on death against them. So the big thing about the strat is it allows you to choose priority targets that have a decent volume of attacks. Example might be something like Eradicators, and be able to essentially target those units down and get rid of them, even if they think that they're safe. So I've really made a mess of my hobby table, and there's 1,000 more things I could talk about in terms of how I deploy, how I move my models. I mean, the basics and the fundamentals of it all is you want to keep your important utility casters, like the Epitome over here, outside of range of being able to be denied. At least for that crucial first turn of the game. You always want LAKOR to be trying to do things actively. He's an expensive model, and if you're just hiding him behind walls all game, and that's not influencing the run of play, you're probably just going to be outpaced by your opponent's army. So use him in ways that threaten your opponent. Maybe don't trade him off, but even just having him present near an objective sometimes is enough to make that be your objective. So there's a lot of fundamentals that go into playing this army, a lot of movement tricks, a lot of cool stuff you can do with splitting. But at the end of the day, one of the most important things with this army, as with every army, is to just practice it. Get comfortable with the movement tricks. Make sure that you're screening when you need to screen, you're making wraps when you need to wrap, and that you keep practicing with summoning. I could go through my summoning box on another video, but essentially, the big thing is to have units that you can bring out that are going to help you play the trade game or play the mission better. Units that kill stuff are not really that present in the Demon's book. Pretty much the only one that I would ever summon that kills stuff or has the intention of killing stuff when I summon it is going to be something like Flamers of Zinich. And those are things that because you have like incursion with your Master of Possessions, you can maybe put in some interesting areas turn 1. They're pretty effective against like specifically Eldar. But I digress. Like, I could talk about summoning all day. The last thing I want to mention, and this is an interesting one, so always check with your TO if you have any questions. But as far as I can tell, this is the way that it works, and this was the way that it was allowed to be played in Seattle. The Disciples of LAKOR, Army of Renown, says that your troops that are demonic disciples gain the objective secured ability, which is pretty cool. But what's important there is it says, in your army. Most things that give you OBSEC, most of those detachment rules that give you OBSEC are detachment locked. So if you're playing a demon faction and you summon a unit to the table, like if LAKOR summoned this Plague Bearer over here to the table and he was not as part of his own Army of Renown, then this unit I would summon does not get my detachment bonuses, which essentially just means he doesn't get OBSEC. This would be no OBSEC Plague Bearer, which that doesn't sound very good to me. However, if you summon under Disciples of LAKOR, it specifically says when you add units to your army, like that it says you add it to your army. So that objective secured ability, actually, because Army of Renown says all of my dudes get objective secured, it gives those dudes objective secured as well. It's the only instance of that I've been able to find in the game, and at the moment, it seems that rules as written, demonic disciples troops that you summon to the battlefield because of the benefit section of your Army of Renown also gain objective secured, which I cannot stress enough how crazy good that is, because you can summon MSU, or that just essentially means really small units, of demons to contest midfield objectives from like behind a wall or whatever with a character. You can just keep like summoning a small OBSEC unit on an objective over and over again, and they're really, really irritating for your opponent to have to keep pushing off to get that objective from you. So lots of cool stuff you can do. There's infinite depth to this army, and again, this is just really what I would say are some of the basics. There's all kinds of crazy situations you'll find on the tabletop when you're playing this army.